The source of the information and its reliability, our ability to corroborate the information, along with historical trends and context, are just some of the considerations that are weighed in assessing intelligence. The threshold for sharing intelligence and advice is not an exact science. Some intelligence shared is called raw intelligence, which may be uncorroborated by other information or come from a new and untested source. Uncorroborated intelligence may prove to be highly credible in time, but requires rigorous validation. All intelligence products include appropriate caveats and reliability assessment to inform the recipient. By pulling all of the individual pieces together, we have a better understanding of the threat picture, including any gaps, any intelligence gaps that remain. Assessed intelligence products are shared to inform decision-making by the Government of Canada. We are highly responsive to the government's intelligence priorities and requirements and adjust our collection according to the changing threats to ensure that we meet the government needs. My colleague, the National Security Intelligence Advisor, recently noted to this committee, however, the importance that decision makers not only read intelligence, but they also receive advice on how to act on that intelligence. The appropriate response may vary in any given scenarios and must always consider the need to protect highly sensitive sources and investigations. It is also important to remember that intelligence is not evidence, although it can provide important information for law enforcement action. It is essential that intelligence meet the needs of its clients and customers. The National Security Intelligence Advisor also noted that there are improvements to be made to continually refine how intelligence remains a pillar of decision-making. My officials and I are committed to getting this right. Foreign interference is a perennial problem that has grown in scale and complexity in our digital world. Canadians alone are not alone in facing this threat. The world is changing with a return to states exercising hard power, interest in attacks against democratic values. A weakened rules-based system, increasingly characterized by disruptive events, is just as ripe for exploitation by state influencers as it is by extremists. As security practitioners, we are acutely aware of these connections. Emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence will only further exacerbate these challenges. Protecting our values and prosperity in this new world is a priority of Canada and our allies. The stakes are high. This is a fight for democracy, which requires us to build societal resilience against foreign interference and bolster our democratic institutions. To do this, we need appropriate tools and authorities to counter threats and protect Canadian values. Informed and trusted discussions among communities, academia, businesses, and governments at all levels is necessary to properly calibrate our responses and ensure our toolkits are fit for purpose. Addressing foreign interference and protecting Canada's national security requires input from all corners of Canadian society. Countering this systemic national threat requires partnership with all Canadians. Le SCRS est résolu à être
CSIS is determined to be a partner, a committed partner in this effort, and will continue to fulfill its mission to keep Canadians safe and secure. With that, Madam Chair, I will be pleased to answer the questions from you and your colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Vigneault, for your comments. I appreciate the pace.
In the past that you've joined us and you've spoken quickly, and that's not helped with the two official languages. So I would appreciate that we would continue with that pace. And as always, regardless of the language that the question is posed, you have the ability to answer in the language of your choice. And when it comes to interpretation, that time will not be taken away from the member. So if we can just maintain that pace to ensure that anyone listening, and I'm sure there's many people listening, because this is a very important topic, that we do just maintain the pace. And I would appreciate that all members also just remember when switching from one language to another, that just a slight pause between one language from the other allows people watching virtually or online or later, it would be appreciated. So thank you for providing me those 45 seconds back from your 10 minutes. And now we will enter into 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Sohoda, and then Madame Gaudreau, and then Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Cooper, through the chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Vigneault, for appearing once again, and thank you, Ms. Henderson, for being here this evening. Mr. Vigneault, through you, Madam Chair, at page 27 of the Johnson report, Mr. Johnson states that an issues management note was sent from CSIS to the then Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, his deputy minister, as well as Minister Blair's chief of staff, in May of 2021, warning that Member of Parliament Michael Chong, another MP, and their family in China were being targeted by the Beijing regime. Is Mr. Johnson's report accurate in that regard?
Madam Chair, the report is indeed accurate.
And Mr. Johnson further states at page 27 that IMU was not seen by the minister as chief of staff or the deputy minister because they did not have access at the time to what he called the top secret network email. Is Mr. Johnson correct in that regard?
Madam Chair, that's the understanding I have from what Mr. Johnson said after having an interview or discussion with Minister Blair. So that is the understanding I have through the report.
Well, do you have any knowledge or information that Minister Blair had knowledge of that, IMU, at the time?
Madam Chair, I did not have any specific discussion with Minister Blair about that specific note.
Okay. Well, Minister Blair has a very different version of events. He said, first of all, that there is no email account. So that is precisely contrary to what Mr. Johnson states in his report. How can what Mr. Johnson concludes be reconciled with what Mr. Blair told this committee on June the 1st?
Madam Chair, my understanding of how the information flows from an agency to a minister is that this is sent to the department. In this case, Department of Public Safety is the department supporting the minister. And that would be one of the most usual way that information reaches a minister on a topic like this. So it will be unusual for the minister to receive classified information directly through electronic means.
Okay, but it was sent by electronic means, is that right?
Yes, the way that we CSIS would be communicating this information to the department for onward transmission to the minister is by secure electronic means.
Okay, and that's presumably why, for example, his deputy minister would have been sent via IMU in addition to the minister and his chief of staff. But again, Minister Blair says there's no email account, and he further stated that whatever is brought to his attention is determined by you, the director of CSIS. That's exactly what he said. Is that accurate?
Madam Chair, I think it is true that a lot of the information that would be exchanged between CSIS and the minister will come directly from me or from one of my senior officials in different organized briefings. But we also have, I think it's important to note here that we have a lot of exchange of documentation. And the exchange of documentation would be coming, as I mentioned earlier, through mostly electronic means to the department to be able to be printed and made available to the minister. So these would be the two most common ways that we would be exchanging information.
Minister Blair went further. He said you, as the director of CSIS, would decide what to brief him on, that he would wait for you to advise him? And secondly, he said, quote, the director determined that this was not information the minister needed to know, so I was never notified of the existence of that intelligence, nor was it ever shared with me. That's what he said on June 1st. Did you determine that this was information, that information being the IMU, that the minister did not need to know?
Madam Chair, in this specific case, there's two ways that the information would be shared. One is when we have intelligence reports. Those intelligence reports are written and shared with the department to be curated for the minister. So it will depend on the department's decision from time to time to see what the minister will have access to. But it's also important that when we see we have something of high importance, we have instituted this process called information management note that would be shared to bring attention to something more specifically. And that was the purpose of this note. It was to bring it to the attention of those people who were destined to. I would like to add, Madam Chair, that it's clear that Minister Blair, in his testimony, has mentioned that he has not seen that note, and I have no reason to doubt that.
But he said that you determined that that information was something he didn't need to know, and from what I understand from what the answer you just provided, that that's not the case. You didn't make that decision.
Madam Chair, that would be an accurate description, and I think the fact that we did an issue management note speaks to the notion that we wanted to highlight the information.
Oh, boy.
Thank you. And I hope that hearing the beep and the fact that we had another question following that beep has demonstrated my intentions as chair to show that if one person speaks after the other, that I also will be courteous to provide it. I will return the courtesy if it is given to the chair. If the courtesy is not offered to the chair, it will not be returned. So the onus is on members to have the courtesy returned, and I hope that is understood by my comment at the top of this meeting. Madame Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question to Mr. Vigneault is regarding the new ministerial directive that has been given in May by Minister Mendicino. The directive given to CSIS means now that you'll have to investigate and, in addition to that, disclose. I mean, I guess you're generally investigating, but disclose any foreign threats against parliamentarians and or their families. There has been some talk by other witnesses as well what this would mean. There are many questions we have as to whether you have started to undertake that work. Have you started to contact parliamentarians? When would this new expanded process begin? And if it already has begun, what does that process look like? And I guess the follow-up to that also is, what are your concerns or comments that you might have regarding that? Because there have been some concerns brought up that perhaps briefing us on every matter may also lead to some confusion at times.
Thank you to you, Madam Chair. I think it's, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, CSIS has been investigated for interference since its inception in 1984. It's part of the Act, and that includes foreign interference directed at elected officials. And so from that point of view, and we have reported on this publicly, as I mentioned, for over 30 years. The ministerial directive, I think, is a helpful tool to help clarify the intent of the minister in how we are exercising these authorities. And so that is, I can tell you, that is already been put in motion. We are developing plans and approaches to talk to other elected officials. And that ministerial directive, Madam Chair, is also important to taking into consideration of the limitations that I have mentioned, the CSIS Act is clearly limiting the ability of CSIS to share classified information. So I think between an act that is showing its age in terms of the ability to exercise our authorities and share information, and the new ministerial directive, I think it's providing better clarity, and we hope that it is going to be helping the ability that CSIS has to share that information that is crucial for members of parliament to have.
Vigneault, are you suggesting that there need to be relevant updates made to the CSIS Act as well, so that it goes hand in hand with the new directive?
So, Madam Chair, it has been recognized by a number of experts outside the government. It has been recognized by Minister Mendicino and Minister LeBlanc as recently as a couple of weeks ago in their comments that there is a need to review the CSIS Act. The National Security Committee of Intelligence, an Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, and SICOP has noted the fact that the CSIS Act needed to be updated. The commissioner of Mr. Commissioner Rouleau in the Commission of Inquiry that taken place last year has noted that even though it was not in his terms of reference, that he thought there would be it was important to have a clear reflection on the CSIS Act to make sure that it's relevant for today. And the federal court has also mentioned that CSIS Act should be showing its age. So I do believe, yes, indeed, Madam Chair, that having a modernized CSIS Act would be an opportunity for CSIS to respond much more fully to the wish of the parliamentarians.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the witness said that there have been processes that have been undertaken. Have you briefed any witnesses under this new any parliamentarians, sorry, under this new process?
Madam Chair, we have started, and we have had one such instances of a briefing, and we have a couple of others that are being prepared as we speak, and there will likely be further in the future.
2022, you had mentioned that 49 briefings were provided. Were any briefings provided in 2021? If so, how many?
Madam Chair, with your indulgence, I would take these questions on the advisement and bring the committee back with the specific numbers. I believe it is listed in our annual report, but I will provide the committee with the specific answer. But I think, if I can add, Madam Chair, I think what is important here is that since about 2018, we started to be speaking publicly, very much clearly to Canadians about foreign interference by providing some of our analysis and some of our advice on how people, organizations could protect themselves. And I think we are now at this evolution, given the nature of the threat environment, that we need to have those further, more specific discussions with members of parliament. And we very much welcome the opportunity to do so.
Has been some criticism regarding the approach that CSIS has on educating the public or providing these briefings and a better understanding to the consumer of intelligence. In addition to that, we know we have public hearings coming up, so I'm hopeful CSIS will be involved in those public hearings, learn from diaspora groups, and we are learning from CSIS and the National Security Advisor as well that there's other countries that previously were not mentioned as state actors that are a threat to Canada when it comes to foreign interference. What are your comments on that? Why have new countries been added to the list?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on the question, on the first part of your question, Ms. Sauta, I think that the working with the diaspora community is not only important, but I think it's the only way that we Canada will be able to have increased resilience against foreign interference. And this is why about 4 years ago, CSIS reallocated internal resources to create a stakeholder engagement group, which has been dedicated to engage with these partners. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Madame Gaudreau?
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would have a great many questions, and I've focused. I'm going to read them to you. First of all, we've heard a great many witnesses on foreign interference over the past 4 months. And what I have really seen is that the threshold at which a notice is given is too high. CSIS produces thousands of briefing notes. For elected officials, the government machinery doesn't have a culture of informing. And most staff and resources generally don't think of doing it. There hasn't been a significant adjustment to deal with the geopolitical situation as it is now. There's been not much change since 2015. Now, what happened between 2001 and 2015? We know that as of 2015, things are a certain way, but before that, things didn't change for 20 years. I'd like to hear you on that. Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. There are many parts to your question, and I'll take them in order if I may. With regard to the culture of providing information, Canada is valued around the world. It is part of collective defense alliances like NATO. We have a unique partnership with the U.S. We are protected by 3 oceans. So we are a country which, unlike many others, has worried somewhat less about national defense. But it's not a bad thing to be less threatened than many countries, but that's how it is. Since 2001, that was the year of terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda, and that brought about a shift in perceptions of national security. Terrorist groups monopolized the attention of many countries. There was a massive investment, not only in resources, personnel, and money, but investment in partnerships with other countries. And the focus was on protecting Canadians from terrorist attacks. Since 2015, and if we look at the annual CSIS reports, we've seen a significant change. The focus is not only on terrorism, but there's a more detailed way of seeing terrorism. There's religious terrorism, like Al-Qaeda, and ideological terrorism, like groups that perpetrate violence against women or white supremacists. So the same applies to foreign interference. We have reallocated resources internally to deal with the threat. The changes that have come about and that were commented on by some stakeholders are reflected in the directives of the government on requests to information, the information they want us to produce, and it's reflected in the resources allocated to CSIS. That shift towards facing state threats has happened, and we are seeing China rise up as one such threat, as a destabilizing geostrategic influence. Russia has invaded Ukraine. We are seeing a return to state threats against Canada. CSIS, in a speech that I made in 2018, my first as a director, I said that threats from hostile states, and that, of course, includes foreign interference, was the most significant threat that Canada was facing. I appreciate your answer, and it does help me put things into perspective. I would like to know who determines the general direction of CSIS and its policies. Do you advise governments where to invest resources, or is it the government in fact, who asks you to focus on certain issues. I would like to see this in my mind to understand how things work. Madam Chair, that is a very important question. And I think in future work it would warrant attention. Intelligence priorities are clearly established by Cabinet. Cabinet makes decisions and conveys to us intelligence directives. Within CSIS, or for CSIS specifically, the Minister of Public Safety receives those directives, and given our specific mandate, because we have a specific mandate as do other agencies, so each minister provides us with a ministerial directive. On that basis, there is a discussion on resource allocation, which takes place internally rather than interdepartmentally. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Blaney.
Well, Chair, before I start, I just want to let you know that I did get bumped off. We have a bit of a windstorm here. So just if you could watch the interpreters to make sure that my sound is good, I would really appreciate that. So I thank you so much.
I'm gonna take that before I go into your time to say I want to make sure we do a sound check to make sure we're all okay. Interpreters, if you can give me a thumbs, I've got a thumbs up. So thank you for that courtesy. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. The interpreters work hard for us. I want to make sure we do right by them. So I just want to thank so much the witnesses for being here today. And I do have a question. Mr. Morrison was here earlier today and spoke about Mr. Chong receiving a defensive briefing. And when Mr. Chong came to our committee, he was very clear that that was very, very helpful. The problem, of course, was that he didn't know while he was receiving that briefing that he was actually a target, and that his family, both in the country and outside of the country, were potentially a target. And so there's some really big concerns there. So I'm just wondering, why was the choice made to give him this information, but to not inform him of the concerns that it was indirectly addressing? And the second part of that question is, how many members of Parliament got a defensive briefing?
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I can say from the outset that going back to my opening remarks, I do believe that members of Parliament should be receiving more information. I think the world that we're in now requires that we adopt our approaches, and that includes CSIS. And so I think the ministerial directive is going to be helpful there. That will still have to be done with the context of the limits of the CSIS Act, and I hope that this committee will have some perspective here. But the approach that was taken to brief Mr. Chong is the one that was available to the service at that point, which is, we have defensive briefings. I think it's important to know two specific elements of that. The first one is that defensive briefing is carried out by a professional intelligence officer of CSIS who has access to all of that information. So it is just not a generic briefing that is given. It's given by a trained professional intelligence officer with the knowledge of the classified information. So it is tailored to the individual and very much in that context. So that said, I think it's also important to know that the limits that we have to brief classified information, I think, have been clearly highlighted in the case of Mr. Chong, and I do believe that this is the kind of evolution that we will see, not just from a CSIS authorities point of view, but in terms of the culture of what we have related to national security, which is we need to engage more. And you have my commitment, Madam Chair, that CSIS is fully engaged in that.
So still, I didn't get an answer to how many MPs. So I'm going to ask that again. But I also want to point out, I think it's interesting what you said, that it was really targeted. So although Mr. Chong didn't know the whole story, the information was targeted. So how many MPs have been briefed? I don't need to know names. I just want a general ballpark figure. And the other thing is, Mr. Chong spoke very clearly in this committee that that was extremely helpful and that that briefing helped him have awareness, and he started to see things differently in terms of activities that were happening. So I'm just wondering, is there a plan to have defensive briefings for more MPs, or in fact all MPs? Is there a general way that MPs can learn how to notice what's happening so that we can also be part of the solution by letting the appropriate officials know?
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. I would not be in a position to share a specific number of the MPs. However, I think what is clear is that the commitment from CSIS and the specificity of the ministerial directive to make sure that all MPs will be briefed. And that's a direction that we have and we will carry out. I think the member is raising a very important point as well, is those defensive briefings to all members of parliament, and I would say all parliamentarians, including in the Senate, I think is absolutely essential. The plans have been developed, and I think they have such plans that are almost ready to be put in place, and CSIS will be an active participant in briefing all members of Parliament. If I can add, Madam Chair, as well, is that over and above the elected officials of the federal Parliament, I think, as I mentioned, we have been engaging directly with elected officials at all levels of government, provincial, territorials, municipalities. And I believe that we need to continue to do that, because what we have learned over the years is that the opportunity to engage in foreign interference is not limited at the federal level, but there are very specific actions that are being taken at all levels of government. And I should have included municipalities into that list. So I believe the member is right to say that we need to increase the number of briefings by CSIS and by other organizations to help build resilience in Canada.
If I could...
So thank you for that. And I just have a few seconds left. So one of the things that has come up again is misinformation attempts are particularly problematic in rural, Indigenous, and ethnic communities. And the vulnerability is higher there because of the lack of information, maybe lack of reliable media sources. So I'm just wondering, is there any work being done on addressing that huge gap?
Madam Chair, I think it is a very relevant point because we have seen over the years the ability of media in languages other than French and English being used and abused by different countries to accomplish their goals. This is why our foreign interference material that we've produced last year has been published in 7 languages, to be able to have information in the language of number of communities, diaspora communities who are directly targeted. We're also working with First Nation organizations to accomplish similar goals. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vigneault. We will go to 5 minutes to Mr. Berthold, suivi par Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Berthold, followed by Mr. Turnbull. Thank you, Mr. Vigneault, Ms. Anderson. There's something I need to clarify. On June the 1st, 2023, Minister Bill Blair made the following statement: allow me to specify that the information was not conveyed to me. CSIS determined that the information could be conveyed to me, but then determined, pause, perhaps you should put the question to the director who determined I need not be informed. I was never told about the fact that this intelligence existed and the information was not conveyed to me. Did you make that decision? Madam Chair, as I said earlier, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and specifically me, shared the information with the Minister of Public Safety. Given the very specific directive to share such information with the minister, I have no doubt the minister did not receive it. His comments were very clear, but I think it is important for the committee to understand that we did share the information on the briefing note. So you never notified anyone that the briefing note should not be conveyed to the minister? Yes, that is correct. In Mr. Johnston's report on page 31, he states, according to the minister, when CSIS wishes to convey sensitive information, the organization, that is CSIS, announced that it has intelligence to convey and meets the minister in a secure facility to convey the information. Was that done? Madam Chair, perhaps I can be more specific. There are two ways in which we brief the minister. The first is in person or by secure video conference. Often, we also send documents to the minister's attention by email. No, I don't usually use email for classified documents. I send classified documents and there are discussions, but that is not a form of transmission I would use. So you announce that you have intelligence for the minister and you meet him in a secure facility to convey it. Was that done? Well, that is one of the ways that we brief the minister. We have a meeting either in person or through a secure video link, but not in secure facilities. I believe what the minister was referring to was that it would be in CSIS offices or at the secure offices of the Public Safety Minister. But these meetings are held in such facilities at your request, Madam Chair. Sometimes it is at the request of CSIS, sometimes at the minister's request, sometimes, and that depends on the information in question. Mr. Johnson stated that he believed that application of the ministerial directive, given its existence, CSIS should have briefed the minister on the issue. Was that done? One thing that is very clear, Madam Chair, is that we are all drawing lessons from what happened and the events that unfolded. I believe there should have been more regular meetings and briefings between CSIS and the minister. Information should have been conveyed with more regularity. The pandemic made things very difficult. CSIS was one of the only federal organizations to work in their offices. That did not make things any easier because other people were not in their offices. The ministerial information, is that issue management note? Do you issue many of these a year? Madam Chair, I would say how many there would be a week. It would range from none to 2 or 3. Apparently, the National Security Council said that 7,000 were issued, and I was told that I would have to sit in their shoes for some time because there was so much information to manage. So, is there an issue management note such as the one you sent to the minister? There aren't 7,000 issue management notes a year. No, briefing notes on the issue, no, are not that numerous, but this is only one way we have of sharing information and intelligence. The other means also convey critical information to the minister. So this is not the only tool we use. But in your view, was this note or is such a note particularly important, and should it sound the alarm when someone receives it? These notes have been created by CSIS for the past few years only to draw attention of the people who receive them.
Voyons qu'on a eu.
Given that we have had an excellent conversation, I was asked for a few more seconds, which I granted, because There was respect demonstrated for everyone here, including the interpreters. And since respect is being shown, when I'm shown respect, I return that respect because I believe that the information we are eliciting here is important to everyone here. We will therefore continue in this fashion. Mr. Turnbull, 5 minutes.
To you, Madam Chair, in respect to our witnesses today. Mr. Vigneault, I would ask you, have you read the Right Honourable David Johnston's first report?
I have, Madam President.
Do you agree with his findings specifically on the 8 allegations that he's looked into that supposedly have originated from CSIS leaks? Would you agree with those findings?
I think, Madam Chair, I know that the member has limited time, but I'd rather we could be a bit more specific as opposed to just speak in general about the report. I will make a specific comment, which is that generally speaking, yes, I do believe that they were. I agreed with those findings. Thank you.
So the annex to Johnston's report that refers to all of the intelligence in context that he gathered, all of the interviews that he's detailed in his report that have informed his interpretation of those facts, you would say are fairly accurate from your perspective?
That would be accurate, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And that seems to coincide with multiple ministers, deputy ministers that were on the critical election incident public protocol, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, and yourself. So there seems to be a corroboration of at least 4 or 5, maybe more sources that agree with the interpretation of the facts in these particular matters. I think that's important. Mr. Vigneault, do you think partisanship has had a negative impact on the national security and intelligence community within the last few months as a result of these parliamentary proceedings?
Madam Chair, I think it's a very important question, and I'll limit to my comments to my position as a director of CSIS. I would say that the politicization of national security is not just recent. It has taken place for a number of years now, and it is not conducive to have the most significant discussions and beneficial discussions to be able to put the country in the best possible position to defend itself against increased threats.
So therefore, when leaders are offered opportunities to review the facts in these matters, i.e. the annex to Johnston's report, would you say that that would be a good way to take out the partisanship by getting fundamentally related to the facts?
Madam Chair, I would argue that any opportunity to better understand the threat picture that Canada is facing is an important opportunity.
Thank you. If you had to compare the foreign interference attempts of Russia and China, who attempts to interfere more, and how do their tactics differ?
Madam Chair, as I've said before, and I want to be respectful of the committee, so I am limited in what I can say in public setting. However, I think there is a fundamental difference between the PRC Communist Party activities in Russia, and the most fundamental one is the fact that since the arrival of Xi Jinping as the president of China and as the leader of the Communist Party, we have seen a growth of the ability in the budgets of the United Front Work Department. The UFWD is a tool that has been created at the inception of the Communist Party in the 1940s that existed in Canada for a long, long time. However, under Xi Jinping, he has described them as one of its magic weapons. And that organization, UFWD's main goal is to interfere in other countries' affairs. So I would say that this is one of the most significant difference between the PRC and other countries.
But you'd agree that Russia is still presents a threat?
Russia has extremely advanced capabilities to engage in foreign interference activities. They're doing the same thing on espionage. The question may sometimes be what is the intent behind those capabilities and what is their specific objectives. And so sometimes Canada may not be the main objective.
Thank you. And would you agree that whatever form the public review process takes, whether it's a public inquiry or some other form of public process, public hearings, etc., that we should do a comprehensive review of foreign interference, including China, Russia, and other state actors?
Madam Chair, I think as an intelligence organization, of course, we look at foreign interference from irrespective of the source of that interference. We look at the threats to Canadians. So, of course, we're going to be focused on that. I can assure the committee and to you, Madam Chair, that CSIS will support any process that Parliament and the government decides to put forward. I think it's a critical issue for the government and for Canadians.
Thank you. Madame Gaudreau.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the interference issue, as a member of the Five Eyes, you're aware of what happens elsewhere in the world. We've seen this in Australia. We've seen it in other members of the Five Eyes, that interference is very intense. Take France. Candidate Macron in 2017 had been hacked during his campaign. And you'll see what I'm getting at. The hacking was orchestrated by Russia. The French counter-espionage system opened an inquiry. And the French people were told about everything that was happening. Why, in Canada, did it take leaks for a CSIS to be working more intensively on this now? Madam Chair, the member is raising a very good point. The issue of foreign interference in France happened 1 or 2 years after the revelations on interference in the U.S. elections, so there was particular attention being paid to this. And it led to Canada's establishing the interdepartmental task force site to coordinate all relevant intelligence. So lessons were drawn from that. Madam Chair, I would draw the members' attention to the fact that CSIS, in its annual report on communication, sets out many details on foreign interference. It probably doesn't have the same media impact as leaks do, but there is a lot of very specific detail provided in those reports. If I may, I would say that the intent was not necessarily focused on parliamentarians the way it was in other countries, but now it is, and we hope that with the committee's work and the information we share, this will all help Canada be better prepared for the future. Well, I hope each and every one of us no longer has their head in the sand. Thank you.
Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair. And I'm going to come back to my last question because I didn't hear anything about rural communities. And I also thought I heard somebody say, may I add? So if there's something that I missed, I would enjoy hearing it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think it was a very important point that we were discussing and that had been raised by the member, Madam Chair. And what I wanted to pick up on was the point made in regards to that ongoing communication, and that when we go out and provide those defensive briefings, the intent there is to allow the individual to become aware, to create that awareness of what they might be seeing that they would not normally recognize potentially as foreign interference. So it's increased that awareness, but it was also so that if they did become aware, they could talk to us as well, and to get that back and forth. And by being able to provide that information back to us, then we can continue to make those briefings that much more valuable for all of Canadians and all of our members of Parliament and all of the levels of government. I think that's fundamentally important, that this is not something that we can do alone, that everybody needs to support and engage and understand what the threat is. And so that's where those ongoing defensive briefings that we were providing and will continue to provide can help create that greater engagement across the board.
Thank you so much. I do want to come back to the diaspora communities that have been calling out and ringing the alarm bell for many, many, many years. And we have heard from witnesses in this committee that many from the community feel ignored and often unsafe, that they've gone to the RCMP, they've made they've got case files, but they just don't hear back. So I did hear you talk about a stakeholder engagement group. So I'm wondering, is there a terms of reference, and what is the strategy of that group? And could we see the terms of reference if that's possible?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll make it an undertaking to bring back some more specific information about this group, because I think it's a very important tool. This is an area that I think is very important because CSIS is an intelligence organization that operates in a democracy governed by the rule of law. We are not in other countries. We're not independent and trying to behave in different ways. And I think it's critical our engagement with those communities. And I will welcome the work of this committee to do more of that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Vigneault, following up on my line of questioning and that presented by Mr. Berthold, I want to make sure that I fully understand what you have said with respect to the IMUs. As I understand it, there are intelligence reports that are produced in the thousands each year, and then there are IMUs in which, on average, 2 to 3 are produced a week, and IMUs are produced because it is, quote, and I'm quoting you, when we see something of high importance. Is that correct? Do I understand you correctly?
That will be accurate, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you for that. And when you see something of high importance by way of an IMU product that is addressed to a minister, it is because you would want the minister to see that IMU. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, the IMU is sometimes directed at the minister, but also sometimes will be directed at other officials as well in the government.
But when it is addressed to a minister, it would be because you'd want the minister to see it, right?
That would be accurate, Madam Chair.
And I just want to go back to Minister Blair's testimony. He said, and I think it's just important to put it on record, on June 1st, he said, in specific response to the issue of the IMU concerning MP Chong, quote, the director determined that this was not information the minister needed to know, close quote. He further went on to say, in this case, they, being you, made an operational decision that was not required, closed quote. And he then added that he was not provided this because of your supposed operational decision that he characterized as one that was quite appropriately made. How do you explain the minister's testimony? Because it's not just a case of him not seeing it. He's talking about an operational decision that was made by you that he even went on to say was quite appropriately made in not informing him.
I think, Madam Chair, what is clear is that the process did not work. I think myself and other witnesses in front of your committee have spoken about the fact that the way the intelligence is being ingested by different parties at ministerial level, but also at all levels of officials, the system is often not maybe adequate, and there is a need to make a significant improvement. And I would venture to say that this is one such example. That where the information was meant to be seen by the minister and was not, and I think it's a problem that we need to fix. It's a problem that is important because people of CSIS and other intelligence organizations do take risk to collect this intelligence, and we need to make sure that it is available to the right people.
And I certainly agree with you, Mr. Vigneault, through you, Madam Chair, that this is something the minister should have seen, and I have a lot of questions for the minister as to why he would make such statements that fly in the face of what you have said, making very specific claims about certain operational decisions that he claims were quite appropriately made to keep him in the dark on a matter that you said is prepared in the way of a report when we see something of high importance, and I can see why it was of high importance given what we were dealing with, which was MP Chong and another MP and their families being a target of the Beijing regime. We know that after the IMU was prepared that there was a CSIS memo of July 2021 that revealed that MP Chong and I believe other MPs were being targeted by Beijing. Jody Thomas, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, when she appeared on June the 1st, said that that memo from CSIS was sent to the PCO as well as the Deputy Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Public Safety, and National Defense. Was that memo sent to anyone else, to your knowledge?
Madam Chair, for sure those individuals, I don't remember if there were other individuals, but that would have been the most senior people that would have been the recipients of this.
And very briefly, Madam Chair, was that memo an IMU document or product?
Madam Chair, if I recall correctly, this memo was what we call an intelligence assessment. So not raw information, raw intelligence, but an analysis of the intelligence available on a specific topic.
Thank you. So once again, I have demonstrated that when we take turns, that I will provide leniency to make sure that we get through our round of questions. With that, Madame Romanado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. Vigneault, I will ask a couple of questions. If you could just answer kind of yes or no to confirm, because I have multiple questions in limited time. Can you confirm that the IMU referenced for May 2021, did it identify MP Chong in any way?
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to speak about classified nature of our information. I apologize to the member, but I'm not at liberty to speak in details about specific information of classified nature.
Therefore, can you confirm if the July 2021 intelligence assessment identified in any way Mr. Chong? I'm trying to get to the point of the question of privilege. Can you let me know if that memo, intelligence assessment identified Mr. Chong?
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I cannot provide the specific answer. What I can, hopefully that's helpful to the member, say is that for the people who are receiving, sometimes, we produce information, even when it's very sensitive, where names are included. Sometimes names are not included, but are available to people who have the right need to know. And so that process exists and is used frequently.
Mr. Vigneault, on June 28, 2017, the National People's Congress passed the National Intelligence Law and outlined the first official authorization of intelligence in the People's Republic of China. I'm quoting directly from Government of Canada website, where it says, and I quote, "The intelligence law highlights one important continuing trend within the state security legal structure put in place since 2014. Everyone is responsible for state security. As long as national intelligence institutions are operating within their proper authorities, they may, according to Article 14, request relevant organs, organizations, and citizens provide necessary support, assistance, and cooperation." Can you elaborate with this committee if this changed the posture with respect to intelligence gathering within CSIS?
Mr. Chair, I can say that indeed this was another significant milestone. It essentially codified and publicized the fact that from the PRC, the Communist Party, they saw everybody, every company, every citizen as someone who needed to support intelligence services. And that, in the way that the PRC is looking at their citizens, irrespective of the fact they may have dual citizenship, irrespective of the fact they may have been living in another country for years, a couple of generations, they would apply the same standard to apply that law, and that they will be putting pressure on individuals to collaborate with the intelligence service if it was in their desire. And yes, Mr. Chair, CSIS took good note of that, and that changed the way we were looking at our analysis and our investigations.
So with respect to that, we understand that according to testimony from Mr. Chong, he testified that he was made aware of direct threats to him early May 2023 based on reports and a subsequent briefing. Again, not elaborating on the specifics, but can you confirm that he was made aware of potential threats to him in early May 2023?
So I believe, Madam Chair, that the member refers to the threat reduction briefing that I had with Mr. Chong. So yeah, I believe the date is accurate. I can confirm, but that would be the first time that we would have shared that classified information with Mr. Chong.
So in that regard, earlier in your testimony today, and I quote, you said intelligence must be shared to have an impact. If that is in fact correct, if Mr. Chong was not made aware of any threats to him or his family until May 2023, would you agree then with respect to the question of privilege? If he was not made aware, how would he have been intimidated?
I think, Madam Chair, I mentioned earlier, and I think it's an important point, CSIS had a few interactions with Mr. Chong. Including at the point where we had that intelligence, and that the person engaging with Mr. Chong had the experience and the knowledge to make sure that this intelligence was specifically tailored for Mr. Chong. It does not negate the fact that the specific and classified intelligence was not shared with Mr. Chong, but that defensive briefing was absolutely informed by that. And I think the member, as has been mentioned, and as I've said earlier, I think we're pointing here to a gap that exists that we need to find a way to resolve because of the ongoing threat of foreign interference in our democratic processes.
Thank you, and hopefully I'll have another chance. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Vigneault, for being here again, and Madam Henderson, thank you. I've got just a few questions to help me understand the difference between an intelligence assessment report, which I think, if I understand correctly, comes from the Secretariat and was sent, if I understood Mr. Rigby's testimony correctly, this information was collated and sent to the National Security Advisor, Public Safety, Foreign Affairs, and National Defense. And what's the difference between that assessment and an IMU or the issues management note? What's the difference between those two?
So, Madam Chair, I think it's an important point given the fact that there's been a lot of references to different intelligence processes or documents. Intelligence starts from collecting information. So you have initial information that will be what we call a raw intelligence product.
You got data.
We have data, we have information. It could be coming from different, partners. So that information, is used by intelligence analysts to create intelligence. So you will have one report that would speak to something specific we know. A compilation of these reports, those building blocks, plus any other information, open source information from our allies, information from other intelligence services, is then used by our specialists, our experts, and that's what they will produce, what we call an intelligence assessment, to try to paint a picture of a situation. And I think that was the document that was referred to earlier of July. The IMU note is what it, so IMU, so issues management note, is a tool that, given the fact that there's so much information, there's so much moving parts in our system, we have put in place this tool to draw the attention of different people, sometimes ministers, but often the rest of the bureaucracy, of something that we want to draw our attention to. So it may not be containing any intelligence. It may just be something that is happening that we want to be mindful of.
That's very, very clear. So you talked about this issues management note, and it's been the topic of discussion, at least in the questions that we've had. The Minister of Public Safety, the former Minister of Public Safety, was here. We understand that, and has made some claims that seem to be contradictory to not only what David Johnson has said in his report, but what we've heard. So I'm trying to flesh this out, because what's at stake here is the safety and security of a member of Parliament. So when was this IMU, or when were these issues management notes, when was this process established, roughly? Could you tell this committee, like, this is not something new, right?
So thank you for the question, Madam Chair. We actually established the issue management notes probably back in 2015, about that period of time. And the intention was because we have a very robust process in sharing intelligence, and as Mr. Vigneault has indicated, we have what we call a raw intelligence product, then we have an intelligence assessment product, but those go to a very different audience. Those go to all of the individuals within the S&I community. So the IMU note was then created because we wanted to make sure we could inform on a specific event at a specific time.
It's so you've got these notes are well established. This is not something new. Nobody, they've been around since 2015. Nobody can reasonably claim that this is a new process, or I fail to understand how this process works. Is there a higher way to signal importance? Because from my perspective, I'm seeing this as a red flag on an email. When we send emails to each other, we mark priority or importance on emails. So this, to me, seems like a red flag on an email from a layman term perspective. But I can also send a read receipt. So if somebody opens the document, it tells me that they've actually read it. Are you aware? Do you have any signal to indicate whether or not the information that was sent in the IMU in question was actually opened and read? It seems to, like, basic email service offers this. Does our intelligence sharing have a similar type of guarantee or certainty that the information important enough to be flagged is actually read? So,
Madam Chair, I think this is a very important point the member is raising, because it's not that what I think is clear is that if we have put in place a process to flag, and here in this specific case, the minister was very clear he did not get the information. So that means the process that was in place, the support he was receiving from us or from public safety did not, in this case, work. Yes, there were the conditions of the pandemic, which I think should not be overlooked, but more fundamentally than that, if it's something of importance, if it does not work for the minister, and again, the minister was very clear with that, it is incumbent upon us, ourselves, his office, and the Department of Public Safety, to what is the right tool to put in place to make sure that critical information is seen by the minister. And I think this is one of the key lesson that we need to put in place, is to have this ability to adapt our processes when it's not working.
Thank you.
I think it's a process.
Mr. Fergus.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair.
just to talk a little bit about these information management notes, IMUs. Could you continue with your response to I believe it was a question by Mr. Calkins in terms of how do the IMUs work? Let me ask a couple of questions. How do they work? Who's on the distribution list? Or can you give me, not who specifically, but a vague number of how many agencies, departments, people are on that list?
Thank you very much for the question, and Madam Chair, I think one thing that is important to understand is how actually the dissemination of the sensitive information works. It is not like a regular email back and forth. We actually have a very tightly controlled, top secret system which allows us to send information. Within our own organization, our full organization is a SCIF, so we all can have that right at our desktop. But in the average department, they do not have that capability. So individuals actually have to go to a special protected room within that department, and only individuals who have verified access to that system can access it, read their information, and print it off. So when we send out an IMU note, we actually send it to the department, and the department therefore is the one specific individuals who have an email account and they receive it. So it would have been a specific individual within, for example, public safety, or within, for example, PCO, that would have access to that, would be able to print it and then provide that information.
I'm trying to now, thank you so much. That was very important. So it's a relatively wide distribution, circulation, but under very specific and controlled access. So then my question would be, when you want something that is brought to the attention of a particular minister, how do you go about doing that with these IMUs?
So the requirement would be that we would send it to the department, and we would then note on the note that this is to be shared with a particular individual. So it could be the minister, it could be the minister's chief of staff, or it could be the deputy minister. They do not have access to that email system, but there are individuals within the department that would, and then would be able to print it out.
May I add?
Please.
Madam Chair, just to add another element to this, of course, there's a lot of attention put on the issues management note, but the vast majority, overwhelming majority of the information that the service shares with other departments will be our intelligence products, and that would be going to so an organization within a department, and that organization is the one that will curate what needs to go to a minister. And so I think when we step back from all of this, I think this is one of the lessons, if I can put it this way, is that this system may not be working as well as it should be, to make sure that each minister get the right level of awareness of our intelligence product. And I think my colleague, the National Security Intelligence Advisor, spoke to that we are doing something different, because I think it's important, in fairness, for people. And I took Mr. Berthold's question earlier about the number of documents and so on. It is true; it's a very large number of documents. So it is incumbent upon all of us to find the right way of making sure that the right information goes to the right people at the right time. And this is not a science. And that means, I think we are collectively learning that this has not worked very well, and we need to do much better about this.
Questions first. Is the RCMP normally on this IMU distribution list?
No, not normally. The IMU notes were originally designed in order to inform public safety and PCO. And then recently we have broadened that, and we look at it again, as Director Vigneault has indicated, it's a need to know. So if there's something within a document that they need to know, then we will share that. But it originally goes to public safety and PCO.
Thank you. That concords with, I think that, because we didn't have a full understanding of how the IMU works, I think that's an important answer and clarification to have to explain some of the testimony that we had this morning by the Commissioner, the Deputy Commissioner, in terms of why they weren't brought in loop or brought into the circle for some of these products. The other question which I wanted to get to, I can continue? I'll continue very briefly. When this information you want it brought to a particular minister's attention or a chief of staff's attention, what's the process that you... I'll ask an easier question because I don't want to do about the time. It would just be very, very quick. There was a framework which was set this morning that they said that we had developed our intelligence and security systems on the basis of responding to terrorism attacks. The world has changed. Some of the challenges for us are homegrown, and some of it is from non-state state actors or non-state actors. Would you agree with that assessment in terms of how our system had been designed and it has now changed?
Madam Chair, I think very quickly, I think it's important. Yes, I would say very shortly, yes, it has been very much influenced. I think the evolution has been ongoing for some time about how we have to adapt to our different processes around intelligence sharing and the focus. And but I think we have done some of that work already. It's not over. It's not done yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess sometimes confessions are good. So I think all of us know that I come from the Water region. Last night, the Denver Nuggets won the championships, and Jamal Murray was right there. He's born and raised in Kitchener, Ontario, like I am. So I am in process of just drafting an SO31. So I would appreciate if members would keep their comments tight so that I can do some of my other work while also paying attention to this work. And we will make sure that all the time balances out. But kudos to Jamal Murray for bringing home the NBA championships for the Denver Nuggets. Madame Gaudreau, 2 minutes et demi.
Ms. Gaudreau, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Last week we met the Sergeant-at-Arms. We heard the Sergeant-at-Arms who confirmed, because we are concerned about the security of parliamentarians, he talked about a memorandum of agreement between CSIS and the House of Commons for information exchange in order to avoid what we have just experienced and more that we may learn about. The Sergeant-at-Arms said that details have yet to be finalized. What sort of protection can we expect, since the issue of protecting members is really quite a specific one? Madam Chair, when it comes to protection against foreign interference, there's protection of computer systems, there's protection that's physical protection. We have no information that there have been any physical threats against parliamentarians. Had that been the case, authorities would have been informed immediately. The protocol with the Sergeant-at-Arms is to find the best way for not only CSIS but other intelligence agencies to provide and collate the information so that it is possible for the right people to take any measures needed. Those measures might include screening to see who works in your office, increasing the support provided to members to provide screening and other services. The work of the Sergeant-at-Arms would be to use not only information from CSIS, but to combine that with information from other intelligence agencies. I'm particularly concerned when I hear that artificial intelligence can do so much. Things are moving faster than our ability to keep up with it. Madam Chair, I would provide the member with some assurance. Technological capacity is proceeding at a pace that sometimes exceeds the resources of authorities and agencies. That is indeed true, unfortunately. Recently, our stakeholder engagement group held a meeting with a few hundred people, including journalists, on artificial intelligence and deep fake creation. to increase awareness. Thank you. Ms. Blaney.
Thank you. And I'm going to come back to the stakeholder engagement group. So you ended at a perfect place to continue my questions. So I'm curious about how people are selected for the stakeholder engagement group. What is the criteria? And does it change to reflect any sort of threat that we might see from other countries? So if a new country is becoming a threat, is there the flexibility to respond to that and make sure that that stakeholder engagement group is reflective of the issues that we're facing?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. And a couple of reflections, if I can, on this. The group is a small group, dedicated professionals. And what they do is they rely on the support of the rest of the CSIS organization or other organization as well. So specifically to the question, if there were to be a new specific threat vector, they would have the ability to get the support from any other experts inside the organization to get the information and find the right vehicle, the right venue, and understanding also the sensitivity of some of these groups, including nervousness to meet with an intelligence service and find the right way of engaging. And that sensitivity, I think, is one of the reasons why they have been effective, is that they're coming with trying to understand the situation, the specific reality of the group they will be engaging with, the individuals they're engaging with. And I think this is something that we continue to learn and try to get better at.
So following up on that, so does the diversity of the stakeholder engagement group reflect some of the groups that you're trying to outreach? Like when I think about the testimony that we've heard right now so far from some of these groups, they've talked about the fact that there's often a high level of fear for people to come forward. They're concerned about their loved ones overseas. They're concerned about their own safety and that of their family. We know that a lot of those communities have a very poor relationship with previous governments and police in terms of the authoritarian government. So I'm just wondering, how is this outreach? Because to me, when I think of these groups, they have been ringing the bells. They've been saying this is happening, and they weren't heard. So I want to make sure that the systems that you're putting into place actually bring them in instead of just pushing them further away.
Madam Chair, I think it is a critical lesson. The member is raising a critical lesson that has been learned. And we do strive to have a very, very diverse group of people who will be doing the engagement. And when it's not possible, given the fact that we're engaging with lots of very diverse group, we put the premium on people who will understand how to work with these communities and engage in long-term relationship. A number of these groups we have met. We try to be careful with what we say publicly because we do not want to for these groups to be thinking that we're just doing this for PR questions, but we also do not want to put a target on their back by the people who are interfering with their activities.
Thank you. We will go to Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Sahota. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Vigneault, David Johnson repeatedly claimed in his report that with regards to interference in the 2021 election, foreign interference, that, quote, misinformation could not be traced to a state-sponsored source, closed quote. This is in stark contrast to what Mr. O'Toole informed the House, namely that CSIS briefed him that, quote, my party, several members of my caucus, and me were targets of misinformation and voter suppression orchestrated by Beijing before and during the 2021 election, close quote. So how can Mr. Johnson's conclusions be reconciled with what CSIS informed Mr. O'Toole?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll be trying to straddle the line of the classified information here. The ministerial directive is quite clear that CSIS is to share all information that we have in our disposal. And so that was the case with in question. I mentioned earlier that sometimes we have information that needs to be corroborated, that needs to be vetted, and rigorous practice. Without going into very specific details, I can say that there is some information that was shared in that briefing that may have been part of that category, but it was important to respect the directive that all information be shared. I think in his testimony, the independent special rapporteur has also mentioned that that there is maybe other information that that he would need to look at, and the focus of the work was clearly on the election, on the 2019 and 2021 election. But that doesn't mean that it's to look at all of the intelligence available through CSIS or through agencies. And I think this is one of these situation that we're faced now with, is the words of the MP in the House versus what was shared by CSIS versus what was provided to the reporter.
For that, now quite a gap, quite a contrast, really, between what Mr. Johnson concluded, that he couldn't find evidence that that interference was state-sponsored, with what Mr. O'Toole was told by CSIS, which was that Beijing orchestrated a campaign that included misinformation using, among other things, state social media accounts. That was also contained in a rapid response mechanism report, but frankly, Mr. Johnson should have seen and couldn't explain how he hadn't seen it when he concluded, as he did, that he couldn't find evidence that there were that interference was tied to the Beijing regime. But Mr. Johnson, which you also alluded to, stated in answer that he based his conclusions on the intelligence that he had. Are you suggesting that Mr. Johnson wasn't provided all relevant evidence and intelligence, or do you know?
Madam Chair, I think that what is clear is that the focus of the work was on the integrity of the election for 2019 and 2021. So I think that the work and the report clearly focuses on that. The discrepancy that the member points out to, it's a very valid point. And as I mentioned, that information that has been shared under the ministerial directive was to be all information, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's information that we would necessarily have assessed as something that with the right level of certainty about the action, but that information was shared with despite that. That was not necessarily information that had been previously put into intelligence reports, because it was still being developed. We still needed to confirm some of that information. But I totally understand the confusion that exists here, and I think this is something that, with access to all of it will be available.
Thank you for that, and you are quite right. It pertained to Mr. Johnson's report, and what was the subject of his investigation was specifically the 2019 and 2021 elections, and the information that was shared with Mr. O'Toole pertains directly to the 21 election, and Mr. Johnson already had his report in translation by the time he saw fit to interview Mr. O'Toole, and then he basically fails to address it and comes evidently to completely erroneous conclusions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
It was more of a comment than a question, so nothing to add. Okay, just wanted to confirm. Madame Sahota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we can take it from there. I don't think we're still being completely clear. I think there's a misunderstanding that's happening here at committee. You had just said that just because there's intelligence, and going back to the issue of the briefing that was given to Mr. O'Toole, if CSIS believes that the source or origin of misinformation or an orchestrated campaign or whatever you would like to call it, believes that it may be linked to a foreign state actor, does that make it so? Is that evidence that is absolutely linked to that foreign state actor, or could there still be a possibility that the actor may be here in Canada that is spreading this misinformation or orchestrated campaign? Do you have clarity on that point?
So I think that's a very important question to dissect a bit, Madam Chair. When we collect any piece of intelligence, we are trying to build a picture. So every piece of intelligence is assessed on its own merit. In some cases, we will have a very solid source that we receive that information from, and in some cases, we may not. And so we try to corroborate that information in order to build the better picture. So every piece of intelligence goes into understanding what the actual situation is. But sometimes you're still trying to build the picture and you don't have a lot of really, really strong. Our threshold in the service is to suspect that there's a threat, which allows us to investigate. So it could even be just we suspect this could be what's happening, but we haven't yet got the clarification to believe it.
Instance, when it comes to Mr. O'Toole's briefing, did you suspect or did you know? What was he briefed on? We know what he understood. And I think this is exactly why, for all of us, this is educational as to how these briefings should be provided, how they should be explained to members of Parliament as to where, why you believe certain intel to be so, or if it's an absolute, evidence that, we have backup to prove that this is where it's coming from. Because I believe, even from the testimony that we've gotten from Mr. Chong, the briefings that were given to him were very high level, he had stated. There wasn't a clear understanding or a clear picture of what was trying to be explained to him in the earlier, some of the briefings that he had gotten, before the news reports had come out. So in this case of Mr. O'Toole, we know what he believes, but did CSIS inform him that you believed that was the origin of where the information was coming from, or that you had evidence, solid evidence, that that is where it was coming from? And therefore, is David Johnston's conclusion, in your opinion, could it be still correct?
Madam Chair, a couple of comments, if I can, on this. And first, maybe just to correct the record, it has been mentioned in media and other venues that the briefing to Mr. O'Toole was provided by me personally. It's not accurate. It doesn't make a big difference, but just to correct the record, it was done by very senior CSIS officials. That said, the very specific details of what was shared with Mr. O'Toole, unfortunately, are classified, so I cannot provide you with that level of specificity, Madam Chair, to the member. However, what I think is clear, as I mentioned earlier, is that we provided all of the information we had, and that includes information that, as my colleague, Ms. Henderson, mentioned, that may still needed to be fully validated. And so that is why these discussions about intelligence matters sometimes require a lot of very specific discussions and details, because those nuances are very critical to not create confusion. And unfortunately, we do have some of this at the moment.
And so all of that evidence that's pertaining to this briefing and the evidence that led you to believe, or whoever briefed Mr. O'Toole, the information that was gathered, that was all given to Mr. David Johnston?
Madam Chair, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of information was shared with the Independent Special Rapporteur. However, the focus of his review was not to look at each and every specific instances of members, and so some of that information would not have been, part of the specific work of Mr. Johnston. And as I said, if information has not been fully validated by CSIS, we would be very careful about sharing it for someone to draw conclusions based on the information that we have not validated yet. And that, I think, explained a little bit the situation that we're in now and some of the confusion that exists in the public domain.
That was very helpful. So it was unvalidated. Thank you.
We are entering into our fourth round. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Berthold, suivi par Mr.
Mr. Berthold, followed by Mr. Turnbull. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm coming back to an important topic, this spending of the organization. CSIS's budget was $676 million in 2020. Madam Chair, I will take the member's word for it. It does seem to be the right number. In the main estimates, additional amounts were needed, $648 million to combat foreign interference. That was for 2022-23. Would you... Well, the total budget, Madam Chair, is approximately on that order. The budget for foreign interference would not be that large. I'm saying including the amounts added. Yes, that seems appropriate. So that's close to 20 million more than the preceding year, 2021-22. So you have 648 millions worth of agents' information that is compiled and collected to create reports to send to people who make decisions based on those reports. Is that accurate? That is the work of an intelligence agency. It includes that, yes. But that spending also includes other areas of spending. But that is the main objective of the agency, or the main purpose of the agency, to obtain, compile, and analyze information, yes. I was surprised to hear that information from the RCMP falls into a black hole, so the government of Canada is, or the country is paying something like $650 million for information that vanishes. We heard this from the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. We heard this from the National Security Advisor, the current National Security Advisor. So how can it be that an intelligence agency costing $650 million, with all the effort that you make, with all the information that you collect, how is it that the information falls into a black hole? That's unacceptable. Madam Chair, I can say that one of the most gratifying aspects of the work we do is knowing that each and every day, everyone in the RCMP and the intelligence community has a role in protecting Canadians. We care deeply about this. We're passionate about what we do, and people are very committed. There is no doubt that having a system where we don't derive maximum information or usefulness from each information item, that is something to be considered, and we are taking advantage of this opportunity to make sure that resources are appropriately channeled to protect all Canadians where threats against Canadian interests are growing. In other testimony, we heard that a CSIS was not necessarily responsible for conveying information. Minister Blair, though, did say very clearly that the decision that he would not receive the information was made by you. I'm not saying he wasn't informed. What I'm saying is that the minister stated that he would have to ask the director of CSIS why CSIS did not convey the information on Michael Chong to him. Don't you find that's very significant indeed? Madam Chair, I've had an opportunity to answer questions. Information did not reach the minister quite clearly, and that failing is something that we have to remedy as quickly as possible. This will be my last question tonight. On the black hole, do you have a message for the Deputy Minister who sent you these IMUs? Because nothing will be settled. There will be no new laws before this evening. Is there a way that you can convey to senior officials that if they receive an IMU, the first thing they have to do that day is read it? We have to improve our processes as well, since clearly they haven't always been sufficiently effective. I think the basic message here is that the world has changed, threats to Canadians have changed, and we need to do better. I have every confidence in the fact that this analysis has been heard and noted, and that we know we need to work better together to make sure that Canadians are appropriately protected. I would have no answer to that comment, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. Mr. Vigneault, you have been very kind and responded to our request to appear quite quickly before the committee. We will take a little more of your time tonight, if we may, to make sure that everybody has the time needed. We appreciate your presence, both of you. We continue with Mr. Turnbull for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So in Mr. Johnston's report, he identifies shortcomings that are, I think, have been long-standing in terms of the flow of information, and sort of identifies communication gaps. When Ms. Thomas was here, she talked about how CSIS actually collects and sits on a lot of intelligence for a period of time. One of the things that I've been wondering is, how long does it take to build a profile or a dossier of information on average before you actually share it? Like, how long do you sit on intelligence before you share it?
So thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. It really depends on the investigation that we're engaged in. So as I had indicated earlier, when we start an investigation, our threshold is we suspect because of information that we've started to collect. And depending on that piece of information, and each piece of information, as I noted, is assessed on its own merit. And then we look at it and how it fits into the greater picture. And so it really depends on each piece of information. Sometimes we could get something that we would want to share out right away, but sometimes it will take a little bit longer because it hasn't hit the threshold of being validated. And really, it impacts our credibility. If we just sent everything out immediately without having a proper look at it and assessment of it, it could really impact the credibility of our organization and the ongoing information that we share. So it really depends on what we're collecting, how the investigation is moving forward, the quality of the sources that we are working with.
So there's sort of a threshold where you suspect something, which then gives you sort of license to investigate and gather additional intelligence. You're piecing together a picture, and then is there another threshold that you reach that says, okay, now is time to actually share this up the chain with other parties, i.e., ministers' offices, etc. Is that right? So what's that threshold?
Yes, that's right. And it really, as I indicated, it depends on the seriousness of the actual threat that we're looking at and the amount of information that we have to sort of support our assessment of the seriousness of the threat. And one thing I would also add is when we're doing an investigation, we begin with the building block pieces on the suspect. But sometimes you get to the point where we recognize the threat is serious enough that we actually need to go to a federal court and get a federal court warrant in order to be able to investigate the threat that much more. And so as we're going through the process in each investigation, it depends on where we're at in the investigation, at what point we start sharing that information. When we're talking specifically about foreign interference, that is something that we have been building a picture of this for a very long time as an organization. And that's why we have been trying to push out a lot more information, and we have also been speaking a lot more publicly about this because of the fact that it is a very serious threat that we're facing in our country.
Thank you. And what is the sort of mandate and accountability for briefing deputy ministers and or ministers that CSIS has? Because I assume within the CSIS Act, you may have very specific accountabilities in a mandate that says when you hit a certain threshold, you've got to communicate that, and maybe there's a protocol for communicating. I'm assuming that, but maybe you can clarify.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. If you'd like, yes.
So, Madam Chair, just because often I mentioned earlier there are two different ways we share that information. One will be with intelligence reports, raw intelligence, and assessed intelligence, but also at the deputy minister level, I sit at a number of different deputy ministers committee where some of that information is shared directly. References are made to specific reports to tell people you should take a look at this information. It's of relevance. The National Security Intelligence Advisor said, with some of those gaps that have been identified recently, she's put in place a new process where we are meeting weekly on to discuss specific reports that have been flagged to make sure that the level of awareness is there and that actions can be taken very quickly, directly. So it is not just a single way of sharing, and it's also not defined in the CSIS Act to also answer the question of the member. It is more based on professional expertise.
Fast.
Very fast. Based on what you've said, it seems to me that the source of CSIS leaks that we've experienced over the last few months seem to me to be particularly problematic if they're coming out and haven't been corroborated and verified and gone through the process that you just described. Would you say that is the problem with how things have been spun in the media, that it seems to me that they've been taken out of context?
Madam Chair, I think a couple of points, if I can. The first one is that intelligence professional and people of CSIS take their work extremely seriously, and those leaks have been damaging to the morale, reputation of the organization. Investigations are ongoing. I think I really hope that soon there will be information that will be public. Individuals may or may not be from CSIS. It's clear there was information from CSIS, also from the Privy Council office. But I do believe that it is important to have a specialist to be able to help people to understand and contextualize the intelligence to put it in the right context. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Madame Gaudreau.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Two quick questions. Many of my questions have been answered, and I see we have a lot of work to do. In many countries, there are two intelligence agencies. For example, in France, there are two. We know the FBI and the CIA, MI5 and MI6. Is that where we should go? Do we need an intelligence service for national issues and one for international issues? That question has been raised a number of times over the past decades. Something that is not necessarily clear is that CSIS is a single agency with a very specific mandate. But when we compile information threatening Canada, there is no geographic boundary. We have agents around the world that are based both temporarily and permanently elsewhere to do the work that's needed. There is an international component to CSIS, a significant one. Many countries have established procedures and processes using two agencies. The process of reflection that is being engaged in should be open. And to be very frank with a member, Madam Chair, I would say that this would not be necessarily the place where we should look to see what the failings in the system are and better protect Canadians. Since I have a little time, well, there's so many things going on. My question is to Ms. Henderson, because in a different meeting, you said that there was a great deal of information on the internet that made it possible to gain a better understanding of issues and make decisions. I would never have otherwise taken the time to read this report so thoroughly and read about strategies to protect me from threats to myself. Now, how is it possible to have the tools, the transparency, and everything else that's needed to stave off potential threats? Thank you for the question.
The first part is actually the awareness piece, and I think that's what we're starting to have that conversation in Canada. So the first part is making sure that you understand that, one, because of who you are and the position that you have within the government, that you are somebody that they would be interested in. And I think Canadians on a whole, we don't really think that people are going to be interested in us and trying to get access to us. But we are. We are a very strong nation. We have a lot of good work going on, and we are considered a moderate power that can engage. And so people want to, or hostile states want to have access to you and be able to know what we're thinking and see how we can influence, how they can influence us. So I think that's the very first point, is just to be able to be aware. And then you start, and it's not to be fearmongers, but it's to be aware and to understand what's going on around you. And then you move from there into understanding, making sure you've got proper protection of your systems, making sure if you see anything, you report that and have those conversations and discussions. So it's an ongoing evolutionary process. And the more that we all learn, the more that we can better prepare ourselves and protect ourselves, including yourself, including the members in your office. It's not just you, it's making sure the people in your office are all aware and can protect themselves as well. And then that's where we start from. And as we gather more information, we can get to the point where we can bring in the police, we can get to that point. But it starts really with each of us as an individual recognizing that people are interested in us and will try and get access to us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You gave me more time. There was a lot of interference. It's hard to focus at this time, so thank you. Yes, next time I'll take back those 2 minutes. Oh, no. I think there was interference from everywhere. Thank you, Ms. Blaney.
Well, thank you so much, Chair. And I just have one question. There's been discussion and testimony from both of you today about the intersection between consumers of intelligence and receivers and preparers of intelligence. And so one of the things that we've heard is that one of the challenges is around political awareness. So if you're preparing information for a political world, how do you make sure that the information makes sense, and what are you looking for that's meaningful? So we have heard testimony from some of the national campaign managers who said that during the election, the interactions that they had to learn about foreign interference and be briefed really felt like a ticky box. It didn't really give them what they needed to assess the issues more fulsomely. So I'm just wondering what work is being done to prepare for the next election and understand how politics works on the ground and how to have appropriate information to guide people to do things correctly and to be able to identify when there is a threat.
Madam Chair, I think this is when we talk about threats to our democratic processes, political parties are absolutely critical element. It is very recent through the work of the Security Intelligence Task Force, Threat to Elections Task Force, that this process has been put in place where there would be people with a clearance to receive classified information has been put in place. I listened with interest to the commentary of the political party members who testified, and I think they've shared very important points to say how can they make use of and sense and be able to do something with the intelligence I think is something that, not only CSIS, but the other members of the security intelligence community in the Privy Council office who's responsible for that level of interaction. I think it's something that, it will be a priority to review and make sure that we all get better to give the information and the ability to use that information.
So you're saying it's a priority, but you didn't say if there's any concrete actions that are happening right now to address that, because it seems to me we should always be preparing for the next election.
Madam Chair, I can mention the fact that it has been announced by the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs that the side task force has been stood up for the by-elections that are currently underway, and would say that one of the very immediate action will be to get the report from site and then be able to make those adjustments as required. So I think it's fair to say that it's more work that will be carried out after the by-election, Madam Chair.
Thank you. As we have kind of gone past the time, but Mr. Cooper has signaled to me that we would just need a couple more times. We will go to the Conservatives and Liberals to finish up this round. So perhaps 2, max 3 minutes, Mr. Cooper?
That would be good.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Madam Chair. And I want to put on notice, and I emphasize notice, a motion, and I'd ask that it be taken up next week so that we can have a debate around it. But let me say very briefly, Madam Chair, that until this government does what Parliament has called on it to do 3 times, and that is to call an independent public inquiry into Beijing's attack on our democracy in 2 federal elections, the targeting of sitting members of Parliament, and the intimidation of Chinese Canadians, and the failure of this Prime Minister to take meaningful action to combat it, and indeed evidence that the Prime Minister turned a blind eye to it. This government has a lot of answers, a lot to answer for, and this is the only committee, the only forum in which questions are being asked and witnesses are being called to get to the bottom of Beijing's interference. So with that, Madam Chair, the motion that I will be putting on notice is as follows. That in relation to its order of reference of Wednesday, May 10th, 2023, concerning the intimidation campaign orchestrated by Wei Zhao against the member for Wellington, Halton Hills, and other members, the committee hold at least 8 meetings of at least 2 hours length between Tuesday, July 4th, 2023, and Friday, September 8th, 2023, on dates to be determined by the subcommittee on agenda and procedure for the purposes of hearing witnesses and considering related committee business. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. We will take notice of that motion and make sure it's circulated around. I will share that with all of the witness names that have been shared and so forth, we have witnesses for this Thursday. We do believe that we'll be able to have a meeting on Tuesday morning with the witnesses that have been shared. This Thursday, we will be notified by the House of Commons if we have resources on Tuesday evening, and should we have those resources, this is when I would take up this notice of motion, unless members have other thoughts, and I would always welcome them because I think it was kind of you to provide notice and to allow us to come to the conclusion of this meeting by finding time next week for suitable resources. With that, you're good? Excellent. To end us off, Mrs. Romanado, 3 minutes to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I understand we'll be discussing this notice of motion next week. I understand also that Mr. Chong stood up in the House yesterday and said he was hoping that PROC would deal with this before the House rises. However, I just want to get clarity, Mr. Vigneault, because we've been receiving conflicting information with respect to some of these briefings. The motion with respect to the opposition motion in February 2021 ended up flagging the subcommittee members on human rights. An IMU was prepared in May 2021, which you mentioned did not reference the name of or identify Mr. Chong. However, that prompted a briefing from CSIS with Mr. Chong on June 24th, 2021, a defensive briefing. Subsequent to that, Mr. Chong initiated 3 meetings with CSIS, August 5th, 2021, February 25th, 2022, and July 18th, 2022. Madame Henderson, you mentioned that part of bringing defensive briefings to members of Parliament is to educate them, educate their staff, and some of the tactics used by state actors. Would you say that it could be accurate that CSIS was trying to solicit information from Mr. Chong to augment the intelligence that you were gathering?
So thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. The purpose of the personal security briefings is so that individuals are aware of what's happening around them. What we hope is that if they are aware, then yes, they will discuss with us. The original intent is not to go and try and get information from them at all. It really is to create that awareness among the individuals so that they can protect themselves if they see anything. And then if they so choose, they can come back and talk to us about it.
So in that regard, we heard this morning the then NSIA, Mr. Morrison, stated that no MPs were named. However, in the Johnston report on page 27, clearly indicates that the current NSIA has acknowledged to Mr. Chung that her predecessor at the time received the memorandum that described the potential action against Mr. Chung, and that also references the May 2021 UMC. So I'm not quite sure, because there's a conflict of information here. We're being told that the IMU and the assessment did not reference any specific MPs, but yet the report says it does. We have some people saying it does, and we have other people saying it's not. So I'm not quite sure. And this is public information, so I'm trying to get it. Again, I'm not asking what was in it, but there's some conflicting information here.
So, Madam Chair, I'll try to hopefully provide a little bit of clarity. The IMU note did in fact contain specific names. The July report that I think you referred to was an assessment, and the specific names were not included in that. As I mentioned, those names are available if there is a need for someone to know or to understand or determine that, okay, I need to do something with this. Those names are therefore made available. It's just for a question of accountability and making sure we respect privacy of people. We just would not put, necessarily the names of people all the time in those reports. But hopefully that helps the member, Madam Chair, to with some of so many different reports and so many different references.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Vigneault and Madame Henderson, it was really nice of you to take the time to be here with us. Thank you for being generous with your time, because you've provided us more than we anticipated. And we do want to thank you for your service and your time on behalf of all PROC committee members. If there's anything else you would like to add, please just share it with the clerk, and we will have it provided in both official languages to all members. With that, we wish you the best and thank you for your service. For members, we'll see you next Tuesday. Meeting adjourned. Shoot. We will see you on Thursday. Meeting adjourned.